Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name is Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Dr. Frankie Fong. Frankie is an honorary research fellow at the School of Psychology in UQ. His research interests lie broadly in social learning and overimitation, with a particular focus on factors that modulate children's conformity. He is actively involved in cross-cultural research and has established a fieldsite for developmental psychology research in East Malaysia. His current research focuses on the role of social learning in the development of scientific and religious beliefs and behaviours. He is also developing a series of studies that compares children's learning and perceptions of information conveyed across different presentation mediums, such as digital screens, books, and in person. Absolutely fascinating conversation today. I think Frankie is, incredibly well versed in his knowledge of this space, and so elegant in all of his examples and the like. So I've really enjoyed myself, and it's learnt, I've learnt a lot from this conversation. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I have. Frankie, a big thank you for coming onto the show today.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
Look, I'm fascinated to talk to you. Being an academic that is very passionate and interested in this space around social learning and how overimitation can work, particularly around children, and how they develop their social norms and the like, and in particular as well the cultural space, because we can sometimes talk about learning in a broad way, and sometimes it's also nice to do a bit of a deep dive and look at, how that might look different from culture to culture. And, that might actually mean, certainly in Australia, from household to household, because, we've got so many migrant families and that multicultural world. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
How did you get into, this research in this space? Where did this interest come from?
It's an interesting story, I think, to share. I was originally from Malaysia. I came to Brisbane, Australia, to study psychology as an undergrad student. When I was considering what to do after my undergrad degree, I was thinking of pursuing a PhD program. And back then, I was very interested in thinking how much of the Australian ways had I adopted back then, and how much of the Malaysian way had I retained. So I've been thinking a lot about adaptation and how I have quickly learned how to fit in the bigger environment by imitating people. So I think that sort of got me into the topic of social learning and imitation. And I always like children. I'm always fascinated by how amazing children learn and how much information they learn from their daily lives. So that's how I got into the current topic of research.
It's fascinating because my family migrated to Australia, and much of my childhood life, I didn't feel like I was Australian. I felt like I was Serbian living in Australia. And from an identity perspective, and from obviously a language perspective, and when you're off the mark from a language perspective. You don't understand what all the terminology means. When I remember when my friends used to say, "I've got to go home for tea,"
Yeah.
I would scratch my head and go, "Why are they going and drinking tea? Like that doesn't make any sense to me." But you just stay quiet. I'm like, "Well, I'm going to go and eat. Why? You guys are having tea." I never understood what that meant. And all these small little differences made me feel like I was somehow different. Little did I know that, as a multicultural country, we, many of us are in the same boat, and there's such beauty in that as well. But maybe you could talk a little bit about, your specific journey as well, in terms of, what were the things that you saw yourself imitating, or you thought, I have to do these things to blend in, to conform, to get along with my colleagues and meet friends, and be part of Australia.
Well, one straightforward and simple example is that I started calling people mate, and I started using the word cheers a lot.
You're definitely an Aussie if you're saying mate.
Yeah. So those are the two simpler things that I could pick up in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, wow. Maybe we can jump into tell me a little bit more about your research.
So my research focus is mainly on social learning, and particularly it's about imitation, and it's about overimitation. The terms overimitation refers to this inclination to not only imitate what's functional or what's practical, what makes sense, but also this tendency to replicate particular actions that may lead to a less efficient manner, or which may lead to some form of unnecessary behavior. For instance, if I were to show a child how to open a box, by tapping the box the lid 3 times before opening it, it is very likely that the child will copy the tapping, even though it is obviously unnecessary. So this is now termed overimitation, because it's not only about imitating the opening, which is the essential or crucial part of the action, but also the unnecessary part, which is fascinating, because why do we bother copying something if it's less efficient, if it is more effortful? There must be some kind of meanings behind that, and that could be a social reward.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm going to mess this up, but someone told me an interesting story in somewhat to demonstrate the same, talking about monkeys climbing a ladder. Where
Right.
I'm not sure if you've heard that one before, and maybe you can help
No.
me out. But
Okay.
the story was something like, a monkey, while it's climbing the ladder, or when it touches the ladder, I think is given like an electric shock, and so
Okay.
and then a second monkey is introduced into the context, and the second monkey is told by the first monkey, "Don't touch the ladder; it'll electrocute you or give you a shock." And then the experimenters turn off the electricity or the shocking mechanism, and they introduce a third monkey. And the third monkey, that's obviously never experienced this, is told by the first and the second. And obviously there's a learning that goes on, that you don't go out and touch that. Obviously, you and I can see the evolutionary basis of that is perfect, very functional.
Yeah.
Having said that, we can see in our own lives, many of us can over imitate and talk about things that we don't have any actual knowledge of, like, global warming, and what are the impacts and affects, and what does CO2 go out and do. So we tend to parrot these things, and it does seem logical, and it seems like, it's scientifically corroborated. At the same time, what do I know about any of the models? As a matter of fact, I've never looked at one of the models. I've never read a model. I don't even understand how the models are made. I don't know the statistical analyses and what's put in, but I can comfortably say, oh, global warming is X. I have heard very different opinions, though, at the same time, without quite compelling arguments too, which say, well, it might also just mean that where we do agricultural harvesting and stuff, somewhere where you couldn't do it before, you might be able to, and so on and so forth. And so it's not a clean-cut argument, but we can easily overimitate with our beliefs and viewpoints and our opinions.
Yeah, and it reminds me of studying or viewing overimitation as a process-oriented mechanism. That is, why do we display such tendency to overimitate? Because we think somehow that the process is far more important than an outcome. Imagine building a house. What's the first thing one person would do before building a house? He or she might look at how previous people have built their houses, or how previous generation had built their houses, and then they might get inspired that way. And this is how knowledge get carried over across different generations as well. That we don't only invent or innovate, but we also carry on knowledge that were passed through from the previous generation. And very often, I think overimitation, or this form of faithful transmission of knowledge, enable us to rapidly acquire a mass body of knowledge, because you don't really need to think. But what you do is, why don't you copy first before questioning questioning it? And it will also avoid potential erroneous attempts when we experiment things ourselves, or when we explore things ourselves. It tends to take longer, and it's more prone to errors than this form of high fidelity copying or overimitation. So
that makes so much sense. I've got 2 children, and everything they do at the moment is really imitation, and it means that they can adopt social norms and safe behaviors, and ensure that they are accepted by their peers, and all these sorts of things. And it's the Bobo doll experiment, right? You go out and just do whatever was told. And I love your example of opening up a jar. You tap it 3 times and then unscrew the lid. Children will do that.
Yeah, and because there's so much to learn about how to behave properly, how to do things in a culturally appropriate manner. It perhaps is. And some of these behaviors are so complicated that it is so hard for a child to process. If a child has to think about, okay, why do I need to do first? And then why can't I do the second action first? If a child could be too young to process all the complicated logics behind a sophisticated behavior. Therefore, perhaps this form of overimitation is helpful in terms of acquiring a vast amount of behaviors first, and then thinking about refining and finding one that suits you best later on. It's like collecting raw materials and building blocks, and then finding your own identity and your own profile later on. So this is the copy now and refine account that certain researchers focus on, but some researchers tend to focus more on the social affiliative account of overimitation. That is, it doesn't only allow us to rapidly acquire a vast diversity of behaviors, it also allows us to identify with our in-group or our cultural group. And it helps us to quickly learn about the social norms around us. It is a way to enhance our group identity.
Mm. And that is a pivotal
Because you
evolutionary
never
norm
go wrong by
which
copying those around you. People will quickly say, yeah, look, you're behaving in the same way, we belong to the same group. So therefore you form this kind of social bonds very easily. Even those the behaviors you do might look silly or redundant, but you are behaving in the same way that gives you a good social reward of feeling you're part of the group.
Yeah, very much, very much Asher's conformity studies, the early
Yes,
works
yes.
of just agreeing because the others have agreed, because that just, keeps you in better stead. It's wiser to do that. But I like the idea of, copy now and then refine and truth be told, as you say, kids don't have that processing ability. And parents know this, because when you try and actually provide a logic, if a child says, oh, why do I have to? Once you start providing a lot of logic and reasoning, they're like, okay, don't worry about it. They don't want to hear it. They can't go into those depths, or they don't have the attention span. They don't actually have the interest. They're just saying, I don't want to. Why usually means I don't want to, or bargaining chip.
Yeah, and what got me very interested lately is imitative flexibility. That is, children, as they grow older, they become more likely to over-imitate. That is, they become very interested in copying redundant actions, seeing those as a form of social norms. But at the same time, they actually also develop strong instrumental judgments about behaviors. That is, if copying means that we'll risk them failing a task, or that will risk them losing certain goals, then they won't imitate or over-imitate. They will instead follow their own intuition into a certain task. For instance, we gave children a task of cookie crushing. We showed children how to crush a cookie, either using a soft pom-pom tool or a hammer-like tool. But we told children, everybody here uses the pom-pom. Nobody uses the hammer. Most children did not copy the socially modeled actions, even though there was some form of social pressure.
Yeah, wow. I imagine. Well, my apologies. I'm interested in what age those children were, and whether they had already had some exposure, obviously, in their upbringing at home. In terms of a hammer is, a tool. The utility is to hit things with it, and it does crush things.
So this study has been replicated many times, and a good friend and a collaborator in the US have tried this with Asian American children and Caucasian American children, and they found that when they increased the social pressure by getting more models to repeat using the pom-pom tool, Caucasian American children were not affected by that, but the Asian American children tended to copy the redundant choice of using the pom-pom to crush the cookie. So this actually shows us the importance of considering cultural factors or cultural background, and I think it also inspires me to not think about, so what is a better way, or so what upbringing is better, but why is there a difference? So embracing difference and diversity, perhaps, well, the interpretation is that it's a kind of politeness to be respectful, not to because they also found that when the experimenter went away, when the child was alone, they actually went back to the hammer instead of copying the pom-pom. So it's a form of respect. And it could also be due to this kind of expectations to not confront someone when someone will not voice out your true opinions when even though you knew that someone was totally wrong, or it's just different cultural expectations, I guess. And I thought your point about different upbringings or parenting styles or family environment is a very interesting one too. There's a trend in our field to study individual differences. And in the field of social learning, researchers become very interested in studying how the amount of autonomy given to children, or the amount of authoritarianism, that is the parent becoming the authoritarian figure, expecting children to follow rules all the time, versus parents giving a lot of autonomy for children to make their own decisions, and how might this impact children's social learning tendency, or particularly imitative tendency.
Is that somewhat of the hypothesis potentially that explains some of the Asian American conformity being greater, even when obviously the redundant choice of the pom-pom was provided? That something in the upbringing, in the culture, in the expectations of the mum and dad.
Exactly. Perhaps there's more emphasis on rules following and following the authority figure versus voicing out your own opinions, being yourself.
Wow. And what are the implications of that in terms of, are there studies that look at functionality of that? Because obviously we all get through, and there's all different shapes and sizes, but are there some pitfalls that we see in not necessarily stacking one against another? So not trying to say what's the parenting style, what's the right culture, but what are the things we should look out for, in either of those directions, where lots of autonomy or quite directed? So is it more overimitation, or is it more maybe open learning, where a child gets to effectively have that autonomy and do the repeats, and it's almost like a behavioral reinforcement and cognitive reinforcement?
I think it's more like a preference, because for example, let's say there's a cultural group that really values autonomy, so the way children learn and behave is highly autonomous. That is, they very much value independence, but in a way they are actually conforming to this bigger environment of valuing independence. So it is one form of imitation or conformity, just that everyone thinks that we should value independence, and we should not care about how other people are behaving. So this is actually a prominent feature of small-scale societies, particularly hunter-gatherer societies.
It speaks to my pleasure to jump in, Frankie. That's another one of group identity, right? This is why a particular school, becomes like, oh, we go to that school, and that has its own, whether it's prestige or whatever it might be. It's like, we've got like-minded parents at this school, and we're in the in-group of that school, and we do that for suburbs, for cities, for countries, for you name it, soccer teams, the whole lot.
Yeah. But what's universal, though, I think, is pretend play, where you see children pretending to be a teacher or a doctor all the time. They pretend to be a dog or a cat, crawling on the floor, drinking milk from an empty can or something. That's also fascinating, because that we can argue that it is a form of overimitation, where they kind of practice what they've seen in their daily lives and replicate those scenarios through pretense. But there should also be some form of creativity and some form of independent thinking. That is, they would also incorporate their own ideas to expand upon what they've seen. So I think it is a balance of both imitation and innovation that drives cultural evolution, that drives cumulative culture. That is how we pass on knowledge from one to another, and then we improve how we do things.
There's a marriage and a synergy between that over imitation or a form of imitation and independent thinking. So if you jump into a scenario with a child and you're on a farm and they happen to be a horse or something, if you start moving the environment around, they will often say, no, this is how it works, So even though they're an imitation, they know, how to be a horse or whatever, they still are directing with their independent thinking, how the scenario plays out. Is those two worlds are coming together, almost like that copy now and refine later is happening simultaneously to a degree as well. I'm not sure it's quite right, but something's going on there.
Yeah. So it is a little bit of a both, playing in tandem to kind of keep us functioning. But it is, of course, I think more people are aware of the advantages of conformity or of involving in this form of high fidelity copying or overimitation, because, as we say, it serves two main functions. First, it enables rapid acquisition of a vast array of behaviors and knowledge. For instance, imagine how children are taught to write, to read, to speak. It's through repetition and through copying. And the second function is the social function. As we behave in the same way, and as we perceive this form of redundant actions or unnecessary behaviors as part of our social norm, we learn how to behave in culturally appropriate ways. But if overimitation is the only mechanism that we encourage children to develop, and we enforce that by things like we reward a child when they copied everything the exact same way as we taught them, it can be dangerous, because that way we are encouraging children or people in general to employ a default approach to things. That is, I am going to use method A to solve problem A. If there's a small tweaks in problem A, this person might not be able to come out with a suitable solution if he or she has not had enough practice in thinking independently or thinking out of the box. If person A is used to this high fidelity copying all the time, but lack the development of independent thinking or lack the opportunities to make their own decisions or choices, it could be risky, because as I mentioned earlier, that imitation and innovation should work in tandem.
It speaks so much to how I think education has changed in Australia. I would like to say, I'm sure the same can be said around the world, from, directive teaching, of effectively saying, copy me and you will learn through repetition, rote learning, etc., to something that looks much more like a university tutorial where the whole class can go out and debate and have a conversation, entertain different ideas, and hear your peers' thoughts of you, and have difficult questions posed by the tutor, and so on and so forth. And that's obviously, tutorials happen after a lecture. So the lecture is the directive one, saying this is what we currently know. But now you can go out and extend on that, and be a little bit more liberal and open, and develop on that. That's almost like the, first, lecture is the imitating, and then the tutorials, the process, the refining.
Yeah, and this kind of free play-based education across kindergartens and childcare centers, I think they are very much providing children the freedom to explore, to experiment, and to play with all sort of different materials, friends. So, but at the same time, I think there's a misconception about giving autonomy to children. That is, bear in mind, there are always some underlying principles that govern certain behaviors of free play, right? There are certain basic rules or principles that children have to follow. So it's not saying that we give them the autonomy means they can do whatever they like. It's still within a certain boundary. So that's where I think imitation comes into play. That is, we still over-imitate certain rules, but there is some leeway of incorporating your own ideas. So that's
a real beautiful blend,
yeah.
And I mean, who am I to say? But it feels like it's good, because it exposes to a child to both learning options. There's the learning of this is what's appropriate, and that might be because adults have put rules in place, we'd like to hope, around safety, around appropriate things for children to be handling, playing with, so on, depending on age. But at the same time, allowing them to foster their curiosity and potential adventure, or learn at their own pace with their individual differences, that, and they can be engaged and enjoy it, and learn from that. So it's some type of blend, and obviously some children will probably benefit from more or less of either of those. More autonomy, some kids don't do particularly well with that for whatever reason, and others do exceptionally well, and vice versa. Some, purely from personality traits, might like rules. They follow that, and they enjoy that, and it gives them structure.
Yeah, and it's totally okay, and we embrace that. Yeah. Yes.
How does this play into, and this might be a little bit naive, but I'm love to hear your thoughts. How does it play into like religious beliefs, or these norms that families have, and a classic one, I almost religiously believe in, you take your shoes off when you enter the house. That was something that I've imitated from my parents, and I hold that with such appreciation of why that's the right thing, in air quotes. How does this play out, in these larger conceptual, difficult things that are so prevalent in our lives? I think, religion is obviously a big one. It might be, it's probably getting a little bit further into life, but political, positions, and all the difficult things that we don't like to talk about over dinner.
Yeah, so I think that reminds me of how over-imitation researchers, well, some of us or them are currently focusing on ritual learning, that they're seeing this form of faithful copying of redundant actions or series of actions as a kind of ritual learning, because they somehow look like a set of ritualized actions. For instance, if I were to do this before opening the jar, the lid, it looks somehow ritualized. And that's how people describe habits or certain routines, right, as rituals too. And rituals may not necessarily need to be religious. It could be a family practice. All of us in the same family practice this because it tells something about the heritage of our family. It tells us about the cultural identity of our family. It tells us about, so by looking at how you pour red wine, for instance, I don't know whether this is a good example or not. I can tell you're from the Fong family, for instance.
Sure,
It's
sure.
interesting. This reminds me of this example of Japanese tea ceremony. So Japanese tea ceremony has a history of about 600 years now. And at some point, many hundred years ago, there's this famous branch of tea school that was divided into 3 sub-branches because of various reasons among brothers. So they decided that I want to form my own sub-school of tea. The way they subdivided, the way they differentiate one from another was simply something like, I'm going to use a red cloth. All of us in this school must only use a red cloth. Whereas those from the second school have agreed to use purple cloth and not use red cloth. Or things like we'll have a ring on the top of our lid. That will signify our group relationship. Or every time when we open the lid, we'll put it on the right. And for your school, you put it on the left. So there are subtle things like that that helps to differentiate group memberships and who you belong to, which group you belong to. So I think rituals or the kinds of habits we over-imitate or replicate over time serves that function. Again, back to the social function of group identity, whether it be your political affiliation or your religious affiliation. I think when we find what's in common between us, we form the social bond. And one way of enhancing that social bond is by over-imitating how we behave.
Look, I really love that transition, and I think you really understood my question and really pulled it apart. And so, thank you for that. In terms of this question about whether religious beliefs or talking about taking my shoes off, in the same vein, these are habits, they're routines, they're traditions, and they do become this kind of group group membership. That this is just something that we do. Whether it's a purple cloth, and it rings so true to me because I even though I can be quite strongly opinionated, I try also to hold another position which says I am naive and don't know much about most things because I just simply do not know the topic. So if someone asks me something that's political, I don't know. It's too complicated. Right. I haven't spent the time. I don't know that world. From a religious perspective, what? Yeah. I haven't spent 20, 30 years trying to study any religion in actual fact, let alone a single one. And I think if you're going to study one, you better probably understand the others as well if you want to have a really deep insight. So I find myself, and maybe that's somewhat of my personal tradition is to understand I don't know, or at least try and hold that. I might, with friends, I might, go off and go on a rant and say, this is how you fix the world. But it's lovely to hear you talk about it that way, because it kind of says that everything we do, at least we can observe it from the perspective that you're talking about, of saying, where did I pick this up? where did I learn this from? Because it then at least allows us to pause, take a moment, take a breath, be grounded and question, what am I holding, and is it redundant, or is it functional? There's a real functional analysis going on,
That's
which
right.
being an ACT therapist is one of my big passions.
And lately, we have focused mainly on establishing imitation or social learning as context dependent. So children are highly flexible in their social learning decisions. When they're making social learning decisions, they're highly flexible. So they always amaze me that they are able to take in available information about a particular context and make their social learning decision based on the particular context. For instance, by simply telling children to focus on the goal or to focus on the process can change how children imitate. There's this study of necklace making where they showed children a series of actions of how to make a bead necklace. The featured action is that the experimenter or the model would always touch their forehead using the bead before stringing it on a string.
Okay.
And then they wanted to see whether children will copy that redundant action of you would touch your forehead before putting it on a string. And they found that children would only do so, copying those silly head-touching actions, when it was framed as, watch, this is what I do. Everyone always does this. And then we saw high level of imitation. Versus when it was framed as, watch, this is how I make a necklace, children did not copy the redundant action. So children were very sensitive to cues such as verbal cues, and they know the main purpose of the task. It is, well, look, this task, I'm going to tell you about necklace making. So yes, okay, I'm just going to focus on necklace making. Now I'm highlighting what is normative. Everyone does this. Everyone always does it this way. Okay, then now I know I should focus on the process, which is to conformity. So this is just one example of how subtle cues could switch children's social learning decision.
So when they're provided effectively with social proof and saying everyone does this, they will follow that because obviously that keeps them in the in-group. But when you tell them about process, you're saying, I'm going to show you how to make a necklace, that they are looking at the functional aspect.
Yes, so the focus is more on necklace making, and it's more on, well, you should find the optimal way of making a necklace, or perhaps there's this hint of saying, well, you can just make a necklace of your own.
That's such elegant and beautiful research, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that paradigm. It's a simple paradigm, but it's a powerful one. You can see clear effects by manipulating the verbal cues.
I can imagine how enjoyable and fun it is to work with kids, because that naivety allows us to, see how open they are, and in actual fact give us an insight into how our brain is structured, how our learning is structured, and hopefully therefore use those learnings to support the type of learning we want in schools or as parents. Are we looking for the outcome, or are we looking to establish a boundary and a rule? And using our language is the moderator about, are we saying this is how we do it in our family, or everyone does this, versus, a outcome orientated experience, which in actual fact, at that point, they might find a more effective way to produce that, with their own creativity and own autonomy.
Yeah, we actually lately found that using such verbal cues through a computer screen is more effective than when it was delivered in person. So
What
in a
do you
study,
mean by that?
so we had a study showing children two ways of completing a task, one efficient and one less efficient way. And we told children everybody uses the less efficient way and nobody uses the more efficient way. So for the less efficient way, children had to build a tool themselves using Lego or using magnetic pieces. Whereas for the more efficient way, it is a readily made tool like a bent pipe cleaner or a stick. So we found that when the demonstration was on a computer screen, imitation rates was higher than when it was demonstrated in person. It was totally unexpected. And our speculation is, and this of course requires more follow-up studies to validate our speculation or our interpretation, is that perhaps it is how we view screen information these days might be very different to how people view TV information 10 years ago. For instance, when you wanted to look for a good restaurant for fish and chips, the first thing you might do is to go to Google rather than asking your friend. Well, you might still ask your friend, but Google seems to be a good new friend these days. Or when you're wondering how to assemble something or how to fix something, perhaps YouTube is the quickest source of information you can access to. And so there actually are some new studies showing that for certain knowledge, children do have a preference towards screen-based information or internet information over verbal in-person information. So I think this is an emerging field, an emerging area of research, and perhaps not many, well, perhaps some of us are still not aware of how our perception of screen-based information might have changed lately.
Do you mind if I pop in a little hypothesis in there?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes,
it's always nice to throw this around.
Yeah. Of course.
It seems to me like the written form holds authority. That's for some reason when someone reads text, a book, an article. I mean, this is how journalism works. They can write any headline, and it feels for many people that if it's written, it must be true.
Yes.
It comes from an authority. Like they couldn't write that down if it wasn't true. That scenario. And so reading it on a screen, the screen is the authority, whether it's reading it on a newspaper, whatever that thing is. And if there is social conformity in that everyone reads from that newspaper, then, and it's got the power of authority, then you better go out and parrot what the newspaper is saying if you want to be in the in-group. And so it seems to me that text that is maybe separate from the person if you know the person, like that mum's written down something on a piece of paper, you probably won't listen to it because you still know it's from mum. But if it's printed and it comes from a book, the book is therefore true. Everything that was in the encyclopedia is valid, right? It would be printed otherwise. So that's just a little hypothesis that might need to be examined and explored.
I think that's
interesting.
And we are in the process of designing studies like, would you listen to Bluey more? Like, for instance, there's this famous selective trust paradigm where you could get two different informants to suggest either conflicting information or alternative information. A simple way of doing this is you get a person A to suggest a new name for a new object, and then the person B to suggest an alternative name for the new object. And then we ask children, person A says we should call this a mob, and person B says we should call this a PAX. What do you think? Should we call this a mob or a PAX? By using this paradigm, we can sort of figure out children's social preferences in terms of which source of information do they trust more and do they follow. So one way of manipulating this is we could perhaps use Bluey, the famous cartoon characters, or Mickey Mouse, or Peppa Pig as the person A, and a random cartoon character that children that don't know as person B. And the hypothesis is that we'll see strong preference of character A. And we could perhaps draw a conclusion of saying that it is likely that when children are familiar with a particular cartoon character, they tend to follow information suggested by them on screen, something along those lines.
I imagine that would be the case because that's how we do things, in the political world. Politicians like to be likable, so they pick the color of their suits and ties. They make sure you have a photo with a baby all the time. Then you go and put a hard hat on so that the tradespeople of the world go, oh yeah, he understands us. And then you go into the world of doctors and you put a white coat on and then you get everyone that cares about their loved ones or has medical problems. They're trying to capture everything to be likable, and if you have that likability, then and also I think frequency as well. I think there is research that says from a voting perspective, if you don't know the names but you're familiar with one, you just pick the name that you're familiar with. That familiarity says that's safe.
You say familiarity or the credibility of the source of information. So this is a way of looking at it, because everyone refers to the screen when they're looking for some sort of information or when they're trying to validate some information they've heard from their friends or a stranger. It seems like digital screen are reliable sources of information that hold credible normative information, perhaps. So this is a new line of research.
Yeah, look, I tell you what, that's mind-blowing, because I've never thought about it in this way, in terms of from a learning perspective and questioning
and again, there's no right or wrong or better ways of transmitting information, but again, it is this flexibility and context-dependent learning. That is perhaps when it is screen-based learning, that perhaps people tend to get into a process-oriented mode of learning. That is, they tend not to criticize too much about the content and not to involve too much independent thinking, but more in this high-fidelity mode of copying. Whereas when it is in person, perhaps there's more room for independent thinking and critically thinking about the solution. But one important note I would like to make is that there's this dual stance theory. That is, you either would go into a conventional stance, that is, you focus on the process and you replicate the process faithfully without changing it much, versus the instrumental stance, that is, you focus on achieving the outcome using the most efficient or the optimal means. So as you might have already figured out, the conventional stance is overimitation, that is, you replicate everything faithfully, versus the instrumental stance is more like innovation, or you modify the process to suit your demand. Well, this is a pretty well established theory or concept in social learning. That is, we know that children will switch between the two stances depending on various contextual cues. But a common misconception is this is a dichotomy, but it is not.
Yeah.
When we are in a conventional stance, we are still thinking independently. There's still some form of rationality. You're not copying blindly. So, but you're aware that you're actually copying what's socially or culturally appropriate, but you're not doing that blindly, if you know what I mean. So it's more like a degree. If you look at it as a spectrum, maybe you can see it as 80% conventional and 20% instrumental. While you're in the instrumental stance, you prioritize what's instrumental, but at the same time, there should still be some form of conventionality. It is a more complicated concept, but trying to say it's not a dichotomy. It's not.
No.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the people that well, some people that stand out to us that are very inspiring, quite often we see them for their instrumental aspects, that they are pioneers in something, and they apply a first principles approach to a problem, and they redefine the whole problem and ask very different questions, and as such they get an incredible outcome, and we're all amazed by it. But that's actually come from the dual stance of first it was based on highly focused on the process of imitating, that they went and understood what all the physics,
exactly,
the biology, or they had such a strong command of their field to then apply the instrumental thinking aspect. You can't just do that from nowhere. So that's the breakdown of it's a dual stance. In actual fact, it's both, and it's moderated over time and changing all the time as well. So that really explains a lot.
Yeah, another emerging area of social learning studies is we're interested in, again, well, we know that social learning or imitation is context dependent, but as many societies are becoming multicultural, children are exposed to different ways of doing things. So this awareness of diversity may allow children to learn how to react or behave differently in different settings. For instance, when you go to a Vietnamese restaurant, you may insist that you wanted to use the chopstick to have your Vietnamese noodle, even though it's effortful and difficult. But when we're at an Italian restaurant, even though the waiter might say, well, we have chopsticks available if you like to use chopstick for your pasta, you would not. You would instead use a fork, and you might even eat it in an Italian way. And children might eat and behave differently at daycare versus when they're at home. So I think they are such flexible learners and imitators that they will adjust their behaviors depending on the context. So they will develop such a capacity to allow them to identify different conventional means and apply them to the suitable context. But that may have to build on exposure. That is, a child might need exposure to different ways of doing things or diverse ways of behaving in order to practice this flexibility and the awareness of you can actually do things differently depending on where you are or which group you are from. There's still very little research on this, and based on the existing literature, it seems like children don't get to develop such capacity until the age of maybe 6 or 7, but we still know very little about this. So this is also something I'm very interested in, is to study imitation of actually application of different conventions to different cultural contexts. And I think it is relevant and it's timely to many of our societies as we get into this kind of multicultural society and as we are facing globalization throughout the world.
It's it's beautiful to listen to you speak, because as you do so, I'm applying all of this to what I've observed with my children, and you just talking about the chopsticks scenario. I watched my daughter not long ago. We're at the socially appropriate place, so we're at a I think it was a Thai a restaurant, and she asked, even though we've given them exposure before and clearly they're not going to use it. She was 8 at the time, or no, she's 8 at the moment. Obviously, because it's painful, it requires lots of cognitive demand, and it's not easy to use, so it's a hard skill to acquire. She asked to do it herself, and I know that she enjoys skill acquisition, but she also enjoys positive appraisal, approval from her parents, and so she had seen, and this was modeled by mum and dad, and even though there were spoons and forks there, she chose to maybe be one of the adults and struggle with the chopsticks. And it shows that learning is taking place, but when she wants it to commence, and obviously the context was right, she maybe had more cognitive reserves at the time to say, I feel relaxed, I can strain myself and work on this. Maybe she wasn't particularly hungry, so didn't matter that she can't get much into her mouth very quickly. All these contextual things add up to her saying, I'm going to participate in this, and with no prompting from mum and dad. So just the complexity and the context and what was exposed before, it all comes to this one moment there where autonomy occurs at that point, and she chooses. And
Yes.
it's just a random little thing, but we can explain so much of this. We can observe so much of this from this lens, that you're providing, that is so elegant and beautiful.
Yes, and perhaps we should reevaluate how we view overimitation. I'm now thinking perhaps overimitation or imitation is a basis of it serves as a foundation
Mm.
or a, a fundamental kind of process to help fostering other forms of learning, such as exploration or experimentation. Because I'm sure children do not only observe one way of eating in their daily lives. So there are multiple opportunities for them to over-imitate more than one way of performing the same task. So it is up to them to process later on. So which way am I going to use? Or shall I experiment combining 2 ways? I'm going to use part of way 1 and certain aspects of way 2 and develop my own way.
And interestingly, all parents have done this, where they say, sweetheart, don't use your fingers, don't use your hands, right? So we tell them what the social norm is, and we say no one does that, right?
Yeah.
And I don't see too many adults going out and eating with their hands unless it's culturally appropriate, so
right,
being, having a Serbian heritage, there are plenty of meals that you use your hands with, right? Especially if you're, I don't know, chicken drumstick or something. The functional capacity about that is certainly a lot easier. And then there's a cultural acceptance of that there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with then licking your fingers to get the sticky sauce off it or something like that.
Yeah.
versus maybe if it was a fine dining restaurant, you might still use your knife and fork and, risk the drumstick slipping off and, going into your lap or something.
Yeah. And it's fascinating watching how children learn and explore and experiment with different behaviors that they've seen.
Frankie, I thank you so much. I could talk to you for days. You know so much, and I appreciate taking the time and sharing. How can our listeners and myself included find more information about about what we've discussed, about your work as well? If anyone wants to get into the field, what's a good way for them to start?
Well, I'm yet to have my personal web page, so that's still in progress.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the easiest way is to perhaps look at my homepage of my current institution or Google Scholar. I can make that available, and I'm available through email. I'm happy to talk to anyone through email.
Fantastic. And would it be right that they can still find you on as an honorary fellow, research fellow at UQ?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wonderful. Frankie, thank you so much. It's a lovely and amazing and always refreshing to hear from someone with such great knowledge and command of this academic world in this narrow space that obviously contributes immensely when we look at how to apply it. So wish you the best with your ongoing research, and appreciate everything that you do and coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.